Chapter 16. Sorrow's Sinner. "You know the drill," Sebastian decreed from where he sat on the table, his shoes on the Admiral's great chair. "No dinner until we have your letter. Get it done." He was bent over, focused on the tip of the sword he was holding. He was using it to carve something into the surface of the table. The boys each filed by to grab a pen and sheet of paper from where Benny sat frowning officiously at them, coiled up in a chair. Already out the windows, the sun had set on their second day alone on the island. The room and its long tables were lit here and there by flickering candles. Jonathan sat and looked at his paper. He remembered his mother's words from the letter that still waited under his pillow. "So much needs to be said," she'd written, "but we don't know what it is yet." His fingers balled into fists. His tongue was pinched between tight teeth. He looked up and saw Colin watching him from across the table. His flitting, hummingbird smile came and went, and he looked down at his own paper. All around was the sound of pen points on paper, a thin mile of ink, measured in words. "I love yous, and I miss yous, and I can't wait to see yous." Messages from naughty boys sent home to worried mothers. Jonathan blew a breath out through his nose and picked up his pen and began to write. He scratched out a message. Writing quick without thinking too much, he signed his name in a hasty scrawl and walked over to where Benny sat waiting to check their letters. Benny looked his letter over with his usual sneer and then snorted. "You really think that'll make them feel any better?" he asked. Jonathan looked down and didn't answer. "Fine," Benny said and handed the letter back. "Now the envelope." Jonathan addressed the envelope and sealed his letter inside and slipped it into the mailbag. He saw, lost in the shadows along the far wall, the sinner's sorrow standing in the darkness. He looked at the rest of the boys. Their heads were down, their eyes away, the dim candlelight glinting off the shiny moving metals of their pens. With a last glance at the group, Jonathan ducked away and over to the sinner's sorrow. In the darkness, the wood was black. He ran his fingers along the top rail, worn smooth by countless sweaty, tortured hands. He bent to touch the biting edge of the sharp kneeling ridge. Outside, rain tapped on the windows. His throat tightened and his eyes watered. His words would never make his parents feel better. He knew. Benny was right. With trembling fingertips, he felt the burns on his arms through his sleeves. Then he bent down and knelt on the punishing edge. The pain was immediate and familiar. He remembered the Admiral's words from that first night. "You have done terrible things, haven't you, Jonathan Grisby?" Jonathan clenched his teeth and nodded and let the growing pain sharpen and fill his brain. His breaths were tight and jerky. The letter had brought back memories. Memories that Jonathan kept quiet and locked away down where they couldn't drown him. He let the pain push them back down, let it flood them away. His breathing eased. His jaw clenched even harder, his eyes closed. "What are you doing?" The whisper snapped his eyes open. Colin was standing beside him, his eyes concerned, one hand fluttering at his neck, the other holding a half-folded paper crane. "Leave me alone," Jonathan whispered back in a shaky voice. He closed his eyes again. "This is crazy. Why are you on that?" "Go away, Colin." "You shouldn't let the others see you. You shouldn't let Sebastian see you." A nervous hand tugged softly on Jonathan's shoulder. "What are you so sad about?" Jonathan screwed his eyes shut tighter and bit his lip until it hurt as much as his screaming knees. "Jonathan, come on, get off it. You're going to hurt yourself." "I know." What do you... Their hissed conversation was interrupted by a commotion behind them at the tables. Sebastian, come look at this." Benny's voice was triumphant and angry. There was an ugly delight in it. Jonathan opened his eyes and looked over. Colin was still looking at him, his pale eyebrows knit together in worry. Jonathan jumped up and brushed past him to join the scene on the tables. "I just barely caught it," Benny was saying. He was handing a crumpled letter to Sebastian, who had stalked over with the sword in his hand. Look what he wrote in the fold on the back." The rest of the boys had jumped up and were crowding around, wide-eyed in the candlelight, a few steps back. One of the older boys, skinny with black curly hair and a twitchy face, was standing at the table in front of Benny, eyes darting back and forth between Benny and Sebastian. Jason was his name, Jonathan remembered. Walter had said he'd been sent to Slabhenge for stealing cars. He was frowning and chewing at the inside of one of his cheeks. He was one of the ones who had joined Jonathan's group the night before to listen to Robinson Crusoe. Sebastian snatched the letter and turned it over. His eyes scanned the paper, and then his lips tightened into a thin, angry line. He glared up at the black-haired kid. "Really? Jason? You?" The kid shrugged and looked down. "Sorry, Sebastian." His voice was a little shaky but resigned. He wasn't crying. His eyes slid back up to Sebastian's. "I hate it here. I want to go home." Sebastian shook his head. He looked like he was going to spit. He held the letter closer to his face and read aloud. "We're in trouble. All the grown-ups are gone. Please send help." A whisper ran through the crowd. Sebastian set the sword on the table and reached to pull a candle in a tall brass holder a little closer. "We're not in trouble, Jason," he said, his voice cold and angry. "You are." He held the letter out so that its bottom corner dangled in the slowly dancing flame. It caught fire, and the flames licked quickly up the letter, curling it and crackling. The light in the room grew brighter. Sebastian's face was washed in the brighter shades of red and flickering orange. He held the letter as long as he could until the hungry flames were right up to his hand, and then let it drop to the damp stone floor at his feet. He sucked on his fingers and looked at Jason. "Mommy and Daddy can't help you." He picked up the sword and tilted his head back and looked down his nose at Jason. "We don't need their help. They're the ones who sent us here, man. Screw them. And you want to what? Go running back? So they can blame us for what happened and send us to some other crap hole? And you want to do that to all of us?" "No, I just want to go home. I'm sorry, Sebastian." Sebastian shook his head. "Home. Home?" His face twisted, then darkened. "No," he snorted. "You're not sorry, but you're gonna be." He pointed with the sword to the shadows where Colin and Jonathan had just been. "Sinner's sorrow. 20 minutes. The watching boys gasped. Jason's face went pale. Jonathan's knees were still burning, and he'd spent only a couple of minutes on the sinner's sorrow. "You can't do that. That's too long," Colin protested. "Damn it, Colin. I've warned you to shut up." Sebastian turned to face Colin squarely. His face was etched in hard lines of anger. His eyes bore black holes into Colin's. He pointed the sword at Jason. "He gets 20. The sword swung until its point was inches from Colin's nose. "You get 10. "You can't make me." "The hell I can't." "I won't." "Really?" Sebastian's eyes roved wildly through the room. They found Jonathan, and his jaw clenched. His sword swung to point at Jonathan. "Then your little buddy Johnny gets 20. Is that what you want?" Colin looked back and forth between Sebastian and Jonathan. Jonathan's mouth went dry, and he tried to shake his head, but his neck wouldn't move. Colin sniffed and pinched at his neck. "Okay, I'll do the 10 minutes. Sebastian smiled. "I know you will. I'll be running the watch." "No," Jonathan's voice finally croaked free of his throat. Sebastian's gaze swung to him. "I'll do it. I'll take the 20. Sebastian narrowed his eyes and shook his head. "No, not you. This is Colin's, and then he gets tonight's coal duty. And no dinner. Come on, Jason's first." Jonathan took one look at Benny's hungry leer and swallowed his protests. The windows showed pure night blackness when Colin and Jason limped up from the coal room. Sebastian and his favorites had already gone up to their rooms, and the only light in the dining room came from the 3 candles set on the floor in the middle of the circle of mattresses. Jonathan and the other boys were already in bed, lying awake and waiting. Colin crawled into his bed with a little grunt. His face was smudged with black coal dust. Jason fell onto his own mattress and pulled the blanket over his face. "Are you okay, Colin?" Walter asked in a hoarse whisper. Colin was lying on his back with one arm thrown across his eyes. It was bad, he answered, but not as bad as it's gonna get around here. The other boys looked at one another through the wavering candlelight. Well, Colin said, are you going to read the story, Jonathan? Jonathan bit his lip. Sure, he said, and opened the book to the page he'd bent down to mark his spot. It's a new chapter called I Travel Quite Across the Island. He took a breath and cleared his throat. The other boys rolled over onto their elbows to listen. The warmth of the candlelight caught their ruddy faces. I mentioned before that I had a great mind to see the whole island, he began to read. And if there was the drizzle of rain or the skittering of rats, the sounds were lost in the words of the story.